May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. So I was talking with a colleague of mine yesterday, another clergy person, and they cautiously asked me, so do you like preaching the Beatitudes, which is the passage that I just read? And I was like, yeah, it's okay. And they said, I don't like preaching the Beatitudes. I find the sermons never work, and I never feel comfortable. Which is funny, right? Why is that? We love these words. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who thirst for righteousness. It sounds beautiful, but the problem when you preach it, especially if you preach this passage the way Jesus might have wanted it to be preached, is you tend to alienate the entire congregation. If you are listening to the sermon and you are actually poor, you're like, no, actually, it really sucks. If you are grieving, you're like, no, I don't feel pretty blessed. If you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, which is the worst kind of persecution because they think that they're doing the right thing, it's the law, it's whatever, and meanwhile your life is becoming a living hell. Like, actually, I don't really feel very blessed. And then we get the woe statements with Luke, so then everybody else that has any level of comfort in society, well, woe to you. You should feel horrible for what you have, and be warned because there are millions, perhaps billions of people worse off than you, and you're going to be right at the very back of the line. So whether you're feeling comfortable or not, you are offended by this sermon which Jesus gave. So preachers don't like to preach it. But the confusing thing about this sermon is that we love this text so much. This is the kind of passage that people, I forget what those things are, the things where you sew and you write the words and you frame them on the fabric and you put it on the wall. I don't remember what that's called. This is one of those passages where people do that. This is the passage where you have posters, where you'll have, your computer wallpaper, blessed are the poor. We memorize it. When I started reading this passage, undoubtedly some of you said, oh, good, I know this one. This text, this passage, simultaneously deeply offends everybody in the room, whether we are poor or rich, and yet we are all moved and inspired by it. Because we know in our hearts that this sermon changed the world. Perhaps we didn't intuitively know that Jesus didn't mean it. It was even worse when we translate this as happy. Happy are those who mourn. It's like, that's a paradox, Jesus. The word blessed, the word makarios is the word that it used to be in Greek. It didn't mean happy or blessed the way we think of blessed as lucky. It meant one who has become a partaker of God. Someone who has experienced the fullness of God. To be blessed, in the words of Jesus, meant to know God. The exact same word was used by Mary when she said her great Magnificat, when she found out that she was pregnant with Jesus, and she said, all generations will call me blessed. All generations will know that I have known God, truly and fully. There is a deep truth to this. Any of those of you who have been around someone who is dying or around death, none of us in this room would choose deliberately to be around death. And yet, any of us who have know that there is something holy that is happening in our midst, something sacred. God is present in a way that is remarkable, and all of us are blessed to be around someone who is going through the last hours and minutes of their life. It's a sacred time. We don't ask for those sacred times, but they're sacred nonetheless. Those of us who have borne witness to someone truly thirsting for righteousness, someone who is being persecuted for righteousness' sake. Because I was educated and my seminary degree was in the States, I've read every single sermon, I've listened to every sermon Martin Luther King Jr. preached. And there's a guy who, would any of us in the room choose his life? No, not a chance. He was terrorized. His house was almost blown up numerous times. He was ultimately assassinated. He never took a day off. He had a miserable life. And yet for all those of us who have heard some of those sermons and have seen the movement that his ministry created, there is something profound and holy about his ministry. Another example was a monk that I listened to monks all have to take a vow of poverty, this sublime poverty where you can't do things like watch TV or movies or have things like iPhones. And he talked about one of the most difficult things about being a monk, beyond dealing with other monks, which was number one. Number two was those moments where, and we all get them, where you're haunted by something. You're haunted by a memory, something you can't change, something you're deeply worried about, and the vast majority of us would choose our favorite thing to do. We'd keep ourselves busy, we'd turn on the TV, we'd watch a movie, play a video game, or just I'd take out my iPhone, and I don't want to think about that, click. And he said, I couldn't do any of that. I was poor, I had nothing. And one of the hardest things he said about being a monk is you sit in your room with your bed and your crucifix and your books, and you just have to live in that moment. And it goes on and on. And you learn to be comfortable with silence and comfortable with yourself and comfortable with God. And it's a blessed and sacred thing to live a life like that. Would we choose that life? Probably not. It's a rough gig being a monk. And yet there's something powerful and sacred about that ministry. Jesus was stating something that on the surface seemed crazy and wrong, and yet something that we know in our hearts to be true. That God seems to visit us in those times of deep poverty, death and sadness, times of great injustice. God seems to visit us in a powerful way that we must admit is a different kind of power than that holy, sacred time when you go to Best Buy and look at giant televisions. Not as sacred for some reason. Even though I do enjoy doing that. I never buy them, I just look at them. And then there's something else that Jesus is doing that's entirely different, and it is profound and huge in that he is also trying to reorder the entire social paradigm of our world. Something else that's powerful, that's lasting, that very powerfully changed the world. He is living in a society, and I would argue our society is really no different, where those with power, everyone around them said, they are so powerful and mighty with their great armies, God must be with them. That great wealth that they have, all those riches that they've been given, they're so blessed. God must love them so much to give them such great gifts. And I'm so jealous they can give all these amazing gifts to other people. What a blessing to be able to give that kind of stuff and to have that kind of stuff. They are blessed. And they're blessed with such great beauty. And the law is on their side. They seem to have it all. God must really love them to give them such wonderful things, to live such a wonderful life. That's the world Jesus was living in. And Jesus was trying to take that, if you imagine it as a great pyramid, and you imagine those people at the tippy top of that pyramid, the 1%, whatever that is, and there's lots of different kinds of 1%, of course. They're at the tippy top, and they imagine, well, they're at the tippy top of that pyramid, they have all the blessings, and then God's just right above them. They must know God in a way that I could never know, like King Solomon, King David, all these great leaders that knew God so powerfully. And Jesus was trying to take that pyramid, and he just wanted to flip it. And say, actually, God has that pyramid flipped. And there are millions upon millions of people with no power and no wealth that encounter God in a powerful and sacred way that many of us cannot comprehend. And it's possible that they may not comprehend it, especially since no one has preached a sermon like that to them. He wanted to flip the pyramid and say, if you're at the very tippy top, the point of that pyramid, you want to start looking up and find ways of getting out of your Ferrari and going up to the base of the pyramid at the top where God is. He was trying to reorder society, reorder the way we saw the world. And it might not seem a fair order. It might not seem fair. It's like, I don't get it. I got all these great possessions. I shouldn't have to feel guilty. Well, it's not so much feeling guilty. It's just that there are some very powerful things that are happening. God is every day doing some incredible things in places of war, places of death, places of injustice. God is there in a tangible, powerful way that cannot be denied. And you're missing out on something if you're at the tippy top of the pyramid and you think that the music of God is the music of a Ferrari 458 Italia, which, to be fair, engineers did tune the engine so that it actually creates a musical tone when the engine moves. But Jesus is preaching a sermon saying, that's not the voice of God. You're missing out on some incredibly powerful things if you shelter yourselves from all those things that go on at the base of that pyramid. Because that's where God is. And intuitively, when we hear this passage, we know that this sermon changed the world. Because in our intuitions, in our hearts, we know the sermon to be true. So we're celebrating All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. And there are gifts that we find at the base of that pyramid that everybody has to give. Those incredibly powerful and those with no power. Those are gifts of love, the gift of hope, the gift of joy, family, the gift of taking whatever it is that you have and giving it to somebody else. All of us can do those things. And those people that we're going to be mindful of this day are undoubtedly those people who shared in common all the gifts at the base of that pyramid. The saints who saw it, who could see that world and see that lens through which Jesus saw the world, who could see it clearly when no one else could. And all those who we love and see no longer, who undoubtedly showed us those gifts. It's almost assuredly when you're thinking about those people who you love and see no longer, the gifts that you're going to remember, probably not maybe the check they gave for your birthday. It's going to be those moments of love and vulnerability, those moments of acceptance when you're accepted for who you were, those relationships that were formed, those gifts that were given that are utterly intangible and yet known to millions upon millions. Amen.